But jamming was great. And I remember putting you on in my club, and you were just a kid, but you fucking believed it, and it was good.
It's the Jamming
Fanzine
podcast.
I mean, the thing about a fanzine was holding it in your hand, right? And looking at the way it'd been put together, and the punk way it'd been put together, quite frankly. And it had a staple in it, you know, and that is a fanzine, right?
Episode 5, The Birth of Creation.
Yes, welcome back to the Jamming Fanzine podcast. I'm Tony Fletcher, and a long time ago, between 1977 and 86 to be precise, I published a music fanzine called Jamming. More recently, i.e. here, late 2021 at the time of recording, a book has just been published entitled The Best of Jamming, Selections and Stories from the Fanzine That Grew Up. It's got lots of lovely reprinted articles, contemporary contributions from those who were part of that journey, and a foreword by Sir Billy Bragg. Yeah, I know he's not knighted yet, but he is in my mind. Now, this podcast, we set it up around the book, but it's not just here to promote the book. It's really an opportunity to have some conversations around the subcultures of those times with, yeah, sure, a focus on music fanzines, especially as I'm not aware of any other podcast doing a similar thing. And to that end, over the course of the previous 4 episodes, we've had a pretty wide range of guests and topics, and I'm hoping you may have listened to those episodes, so I don't need to go over them. And if you haven't, welcome to the show, and please dive on back. However, for this particular episode, we are going to focus on something specific to jamming, because you see, way back in the spring of 1982, when I was 17, going on 18, I wrote an editorial for Jamming 13 called A Statement, and it turned out to have a significant influence on, among other people, one Alan McGee, who was inspired to start a fanzine and a club night and a label all of his own as a result. That label, as you may well know if you know his name, was called Creation Records, and it would become the home to the Jesus and Mary Chain, My Bloody Valentine, Primal Scream and Oasis, just to name 4 out of probably hundreds of bands who were signed to the label over the decades. Along the way, Alan, and yes, that was his voice you heard at the front of the show, became something of a figurehead of the 1990s British music scene, and was just recently the subject matter of a movie named for his autobiography, Creation Stories. It's produced by Danny Boyle, directed by Nick Moran, and co-written by Irvine Welsh. By any standards, those are some serious credentials. Now, I haven't seen the movie because it's not yet available in the States where I live these days, but in the book Creation Stories, which came out quite a while ago, Alan was forthright about the importance of a statement. And so when I asked him to write something for the Best of Jamming book, he agreed. He suggested we just have a Zoom chat, and I used what I want from that. We did. It turned into a longer conversation than just a few sentences that are in the book. And so you're going to hear that conversation coming up in this particular episode of our podcast. But then, call it serendipity if you like, right around that same time I was approached by 2 Americans who were fans of Creation. The names are Matt and Scott, and they were setting up a brand new podcast entitled 50 Years of Fun, setting about the marathon task of producing a separate episode for every one of Creation's first 50 single releases, plus 2 prequels, of which I was featured on the first because of this aforementioned A Statement. Being perfectionists or artists or something similar, Scott and Matt then went and recruited the Californian singer-songwriter Rose Melberg, former member of the bands Tiger Trap, the Softies and Ghost Sailor, as well as an established artist in her own right, to read a statement for their debut episode. So, the way we're going to construct this episode is, as a co-production with 50 Years of Fun, broken down into 3 parts. In part 1, you will hear a statement, as read by Rose. In part 2, you will hear my interview with Alan McGee about that A Statement, how it influenced him at the time and what it inspired him to do, and our own roles producing somewhat underground cultural artifacts that went overground. His obviously more so than mine. And in part 3, you'll hear an edited version of 50 Years of Fun's interview with me. My thanks to Matt and Scott, and to Rose, of course, for allowing use of all this material, and I do encourage you to visit their podcast. It's up to single number 6 and has managed to find and talk to members of every band released on Creation up to that point. One quick caveat about Rose's upcoming reading. In her initial sentence, she has me referring back to issue 2 of Jamming, which would have been dated February 78. In fact, the article reference was in issue 11, dated December 1980. A lot had gone on in the interim. For some reason, I used Roman numerals when bashing out a statement on my mum's typewriter. Don't ask why, I don't know. Anyway, with that said, and knowing we've got a lot of material to get through, let's get right to it. The Birth of Creation with Alan McGee.
Do you want to buy a copy of Jamming?
A year and a half ago, in Jamming number 2, I wrote a one-page rant denying that rock and roll/live music was dying. Those 18 months have proved me wrong. The first half of 1982 has been the worst period in ages for the clubs. But that doesn't mean I was wrong to say it was still alive. I just hadn't realized the surge of pop groups was so obvious, seeing it more as an alternative than a total coup. ABC, The Human League, Atom, Altered Images, Haircut 100, and more have all removed the importance of a group building up live. The music scene in the last 18 months has been totally different to what me and others had been used to or expected. However, I'm not going to be despondent. In fact, I'm now more optimistic over music than I ever have been. Jamming wouldn't really have been that valid over the last year. It would have been little more than an underground magazine pissing in the wind while the pop world, including its press, rejoiced in cocktails, yellow shorts, and good clean fun. Jamming missed the obvious, okay, but the press are missing the obvious fact that this will all die and something new will emerge. Pop music moves in cycles of 4 years, alternating between energy, change, and straight pop, making for 8-year cycles of each. Consider some facts. In 1956, Elvis and rock and roll breaks loose. Teenagers appear and go mad at the new noise. However, it doesn't seem to have been that affected, with pop music still dominating the charts. But 8 years after rock and roll's outbreak, the whole thing goes wild again, as groups that were pre-teen in 56 have learned their instruments and lessons, and 1964 sees the Beatles, Stones, Who, Kinks, and more appear, ready to storm virtually the world. The 60s being what they were, everything moves at incredible pace, and by 1968, we're back around with energy again. Rock music is born. 4 years later, we have another pop boom, perfectly worthwhile at the time, but ultimately fickle. A generation of kids get bored, they create punk, and in 76 start to smash things up. Move on another 4 years, it seems to have been useless, and the nation's obsessed with pop once more. So what am I suggesting? Basically, that there are a generation of youngsters about who are affected by punk, but were either too young to get out there and do something at the time, or were living in the country and couldn't get involved quickly. These people have learnt over the years what punk meant. They haven't fallen for quick fashions or punk revivals, but have taken their time and are ready to start being noticed. There's no doubt that the pop music boom is on the decline. Sure, it will last a while yet, but Depeche Mode and Altered Images are already slipping, with more to follow within the next year. We're somewhere around 74, heading for the horrible grayness of 75, with the Human League as the new ABBA, willing to brighten the times with classic pop, and the Jam as the survivors. Long may they reign. You can shout crap, no one can predict the future, but I believe something is very gradually starting, with people slowly returning to gigs to follow the groups that are beginning to emerge. It seems like the movement coming through this time won't be immediate, as punk was. Punk became a fashion, big labels signed the bands, and they all attacked at the same time. But there were no independents in 1976. Those have now built up to a commanding position, and that's the sort of thing I mean about learning from the last few years. Hopefully the next surge will come through independently, starting to release singles now, though it may well be 2 years before they sell in large quantities. But the thing can be done ourselves, keeping control over what's going on. It's refreshing to see the number of groups about who consider themselves an idea in motion, determined to build it their way, however long it takes. And it will only be a gradual thing. Though occasional records are emerging, notably the first Alarm single, it'll be the rest of this year and part of the next before it really gets going. However, if the groups do get as organized as I think they can, there's nothing to stop them coming through the moment the climate is right. So where does jamming fit into all of this? I honestly believe it's time to put my neck on the line and say I can sense something just beginning and that I want jamming there as a catalyst. I was too young to do anything in 77, but I've been involved for 4.5 years now, and I've learned the history of the previous 2. Jamming's been fun. It's tried to encourage staying enthusiastic and committed. Yet even fanzines have died with the pop boom. I suppose it was inevitable. But we can learn from what happened and get it right from the start this time. Start working towards something now. Everyone. It won't be another rock and roll. It won't be another punk. But it could be something great. What I'll say here and now in print is that if none of this happens, then I'm the Wally and I'll get a nice quiet job somewhere. But it won't stop me trying. Optimism, hope. Those of you who thought 1980 through mid-1982 has been lacking something, read the above again. Start working towards your ideals and let's see if we can create something together. Let us know of any young group you think has the sus and we'll build up a network. Jamming won't stop writing about what is happening now with music that's of any worth, because there's a fair bit about. But I want it to be there and encourage what's going to happen. Welcome to a new Jamming.
Hey, Tony.
How's it going, mate? You good?
Yeah, rocking.
Good. Nice to see you.
Oh, yeah. But you're doing good. You got yourself really fit, didn't you?
I run marathons and ultra marathons. I'm out on the trails a lot. Yeah, I really did. It's actually a really big part of me. I even I've even been doing a podcast about the outdoors kind of travel and stuff this past year. Yeah, it's really good to have that. I was looking at your Instagram. Do you get out walking all the time? Is that your thing?
But you know how I done that? I lost the weight. I lost 35 pounds during lockdown. I did it with keto diet.
Okay.
No carbs, and it's just, it's fucking coming off me, man. It's still, I'm down to 40. I got big, Tony. I was 16.5 stone, and I'm now 14 dead. But I've got a feeling with the keto, I can probably take it right down into, I could get to 13, but I might even get beyond that. Do you know what I mean?
That's pretty impressive to lose that much. I know quite a lot of people swear by the keto. I've been vegan for years, so it's really hard to put.
I know, it's just no carbs, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm 6 foot, Tony. So do you know what I mean? You know, so I could carry 16.5 and just about get away with it with a big beard. But it's a lot easier just not to be fucking fat. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I said, look, because I owe you a bit of a debt with that magazine, because I was rereading it. Rereading it isn't really the point. I can remember where I was at when I read that. And I think I was quite lost. I'd come down to London. My group had kind of fallen apart. I think it was early 82. Is that correct?
It came out somewhere in the late spring of 82. It came out.
Yeah, I remember I was quite lost. And Andrew, who's in the Primals, and me had come to London, and Andrew had got a hepatitis, and through drugs, to be honest, call it what it is, right? And I was lost. I was in London on my own, really. And I read, because of Paul Weller, he anointed you and went jamming. And I remember reading it, because that's probably why I was reading jamming, because of Paul Weller, to be honest. Do you know what I mean? And it just spoke to me, Tony. It really, and because I was never a particularly talented person musically, but I had a great fucking passion. And your passion got me. And I remember at the height of creation, Britpop, and I think I told you it one day, and you were like, tell other people, you know what I mean? Because I think you were a bit shocked, because I don't think you knew. And the reason I got creation together, because you were going, I think you said roughly, the way I remember it, it was a roughly like, start a band. If you can't start a band, put somebody's records out. And if you can't put somebody's records out, put some shows on. But don't sit in your fucking arse, because you're just going to get old and fucking fat. Just get on with it and fucking try and put something in rather than take something out. That's the way I remember that article. Is that correct?
It is pretty much. I mean, basically, I was a very energetic 17-year-old at the time with the platform and doing a lot of stuff. And I wanted other people to do it as well. And I was I was genuinely trying to see the the light through sort of a darker woods where there was all the synth pop bands starting up, and I really wanted to be like, look, we can get through this, go out and do something. And every now and then you get sparked up. I mean, putting this book together, I love the energy of the fanzines. I can't bear to read the writing because it's a kid, and it's a kid whose grammar's all over the place.
Well,
and
I was reading it there, Tony. I was reading it, and I stopped reading it because I went, because that's not the way I remember it. When I was a kid myself, when I was in '82, I was 21, right? And I read it, and it spoke to me, and that's all you really need to know.
Yeah.
It's not even what the words that you were saying. The feeling you conveyed was that punk was still alive. To me, being a wee punk rocker for Glasgow, and being there since '76 punk, and it was just, somebody else. Because everything had went, in music, everything else had went pop, hadn't it? And even the Jam.
It was all going pop, yeah.
And it was like, it was Beat Surrender time, wasn't it? And all that sort of stuff. Do you know what I mean? And the world had went kind of Haircut 100, not slagging them off, but
No, but I think I named them. I think I named them in that piece. No, the whole thing had gone. It was ABC, maybe Kajagoogoo, Haircut 100. It was.
Well, the bottom line is, Tony, if it had only been Haircut 100 and ABC, they were great pop bands, actually, to be completely honest. But from where we were coming from to the punk thing, I suppose that was quite wet from where we were all coming from. And but jamming was great. And I remember putting you on in my club, and you were just a kid, but you fucking believed it, and it was good.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that was all. It was great. Are you younger than me by quite a long way? Are you 5 years younger than me?
Yeah, I think I am, because I was,
that's crazy.
17,
What's
18.
More crazy is I was 21 and you'd be 16 or 17. And I was getting the fire off you, which is fucking unbelievable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I often look back on that, and I think it's just right place, right time. Being 13, 14. I often say to people, if punk rock had happened when I was 16, I'd have been a 16-year-old starting a fanzine. It wasn't because I was 13. It was because of 77 and being in London and being at school.
Yeah.
I think
I was amazing.
I think that's what it is. I was looking at your memoir before calling you, and it makes a lot of sense, because you're saying that around that time you say you were a bit lost, but you gradually understood that you had that ability to organize people. So so you were finding your own feet. So because you did a fanzine, didn't you?
Yeah.
And
I did a band, and then I did a club and a fanzine at the same time.
Yeah.
And the club eventually went into, for you did the communication club with your little band, Zeitgeist. Yeah. But the club eventually morphed into the living room, and that funded creation.
Right.
But would I have started a fanzine and a club without reading that? I have to say I probably wouldn't have. Do you know what I mean? But you fired me up, and I thought, he's right. Let's have a go. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I suppose when you try something a few times, you eventually get it right. And that's kind of eventually what happened. The first steps were rubbish, but I suppose by the 8th time I tried to put somebody on, I was getting good at it. And then do you know what I mean? By the 12th record that I put out on my label, I found the Jesus and Mary chain. So do you know what I mean? I mean, you have to fail to succeed.
Absolutely. And it's like the first issues of Jamming are, I mean, fortunately, most of them were just a school fanzine, but they're pretty embarrassing to look at. And then gradually, gradually it comes together. At first, you're letting all your schoolmates write about Rush and Led Zeppelin. And then gradually you're like, no, that's, like, I've got a vision for this. And you push that vision through. And I think something that you and I had in common is that we were willing to try different things. So Jamming put on gigs, and I had a label. I had my band, and it wasn't like I want to do everything as much as I at least want to try everything. There's what's if you got a fanzine and your fanzine could help you put on a good gig, why not do that? And having a band was always an intent anyway. I do remember I don't know if you remember this, but I remember one time, and I think it was only once, And it would have been right around there. You actually came into the jamming office at Nomis.
I don't remember it.
Yeah, you did, to have a chat. And I was the kind of person, if you called me up and said, can I come in and talk to you? I'd say, yeah, come on in. And you came in, and I don't remember if you had at that point fanzine band, not the label.
Yeah.
I do remember you couldn't have been too far with the band, because you were saying maybe we should like practice, like get our guitars together or something. So it must have been right around when you came to London. The jamming label was starting. I remember I was at Nomis, but
I tried to sign to Paul Weller's label. I've never told him this because I kind of know him a little bit now, not very well, but in a way I don't really want to know Paul Weller, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah,
not that I think he's a bad guy. I think he's a great guy, right? But I don't really want to know him because it would spoil something of my childhood, Alan, if I actually became his proper friend. But I know him a little bit, right? And I've never told him. I ran into him about last year sometime at a Clockwork show, right? And I've never told him that I tried to sign to him, and he used to write back to me because he kind of liked my songs.
At least, yeah. I mean, he was good about writing back. There was a point at which
He was.
There was a point at which I remember him. They did a big American tour in '82, and he came back from it. And because we had the label going, he probably got more demo tapes than ever. And he just came into my little office, and floor down from the Jams office at Nomis, which I do remember you coming in and sitting with me one day, and you just brought in 3 plastic bags of cassettes, and he's like, "There's no way I'm listening to these. You can listen to them." This is like he picked up like 3 complete carrier bags of cassettes on an American tour. Pretty funny. But yeah, no, it's good to get that. I mean, I know that it's been in a couple of books. You were kind enough to put it in your book, and David Cavanagh did it in his own way in his book. But I realized as putting this compendium together, it would be really nice to get something from you. And a whole bunch of people, contributors, but musicians as well, have put in little memories.
Jamming was important, man. I mean, it was important to me. It's these things. It's like my little fanzine communication blog. It was probably important to some other people. Do you know what I mean? It's like nobody's really the keeper of the message. Everybody inspires everybody else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And it's like that's just what you find out as you get older. And it's like I'm sure that I only did 500 copies of my little fanzine two times to put it out. But in a way, that's who I really. When I started a label, I identified as a fanzine kid that happened to be good at running a record label.
Yeah,
that was it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
which is kind of unique, but that's who I was,
Yeah, found your corner with it. And then the other thing that possibly there was in common is, jamming built and creation built. And both, creation became something more than an indie label, and jamming became a lot more than a fanzine. And those are things you have to develop through and go through. Yeah. So in both those senses, I guess whether they were talent, skills, or just bullshit that we each had, there was enough to bring it through.
Thing was, about that time, it was like it was very difficult to kind of go on and accept the bigness and the success, because we were all coming out of punk, and it was kind of not applauded to grow. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was a big one, because people would look down their nose at you at every stage in the way, as if you'd sold out, and you'd be like, "No, I'm letting people in, mate." Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I might never have been able to work out to now. I mean, probably what I was trying to do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I'm glad. It's funny to look back. I am glad to know it was an inspiration. And I definitely didn't know it at the time. I found out like about 10, 15 years down the line when I did run into you.
I remember
we had a
conversation in the 90s. I think you came up to me at some music event, business thing, and you went, "Oh, you should tell people," because at that time I think I had we were number one everywhere with the Oasis band, and I think you were like, "Oh, you should tell people," and I think I did after that. I went, "Okay, I will,"
You did after that, yeah, because I remember David Cavanagh calling me for when he wrote that massive book, and then you put it in yours as well. So I mean, it is, it is. It's good. It's appreciated, and it's nice to know it could have that effect, and that's largely it. There's a few good pieces on the creation bands. There's a couple of profiles that might make it into the book. It's very much a best of, and it's focused on the fanzine days, but it's looking really good. It's going to be a fun venture. So great.
All right, mate.
Lovely. Take care, Alan. Bye now.
Bye.
Cheers.
Tony Fletcher,
Glad to be here.
very excited to have you. We've been talking about this piece in Jamming Magazine and its influence on Alan McGee in 1982. Can you paint us a picture of what was happening in music in 1982 and what inspired you to write this?
I'd been running a fanzine since the end of 77, kind of came into its own more later in 78. And I was very, very young. And with being very, very young, I was extremely passionate and energetic and idealistic, which is a good thing when you're that age. And certainly, I grew up and got to go around London to the most incredible gigs in what's subsequently been called the post-punk world. Nobody called it that at the time. And things had just been amazing. You'd just go to gigs in rooms above pubs, at YMCAs, inside pubs, at the Acclam Hall, at the Marquee. Just saw so much great music, so much music. People were putting out their own records. And I'd started running a record label with Paul Weller, and that was great as well. And I was around the Jam, and that was great as well. But something was definitely changing around 81, 82, and synth pop was coming in, and it was evident it was coming in. It had come in a big way. And music was definitely changing, getting more commercial. And I would have to look at the charts and tell you exactly which records had been hits by the point that I wrote that article. But I could feel that things were changing, and I guess what I was doing in my joyously naive and optimistic 17, 18-year-old manner was saying, no, let's stay the course. Let's, punk happened. Punk was wonderful. Music changes every few years. We're all set up for a wonderful revolution. There's going to be greatness to come if we everybody get out and do something. I've reread this of late, not least because we're putting together a best of jamming book, and I cringe at just about everything I wrote back then. I guess I don't cringe about the person who wrote it and the enthusiasm that they felt for music in general and sort of independent alternative culture in general. And I think, in short, as an initial summary, I think that's what I was really trying to get across, trying to spur other people on.
Yeah, I was actually noticing when I was reading it that I felt inspired by it, and we've been reading a lot of. Communication Blur obviously is very passionate. That's a very big aspect of punk and post-punk writing, is a lot of passion. Something about this piece, it goes further to me. It lays out a full idea. It's kind of saying, hey, punk is an energy that goes through all types of music, and yes, we all went crazy when it went through rock and roll and became everybody can do it. But don't expect that. Let's not just try and capture the vapors of that. It's going to land on something else, and it's going to be just going to be another scene that feels inclusive and like you're a part of it. And it seemed like it lit a fuse more than just put an idea out. It was like, I know you're all thinking about this, or I hope you are. Let's all do it at once and see what happens. That's kind of what I took from it, and I can see why Alan, who already had he already did some labels, and he had these things at his disposal, but it seemed like it just pushed him, and it probably pushed a lot of people.
Yeah, I'd like to believe so. The jamming had been pretty successful. It had been enormously successful. And what happened with this particular issue was that I had landed on this Paul McCartney interview. But I had also been running the record label, and that was just ridiculous. It was full-time. It was more than full-time. And I had a band. So the fanzine didn't come out for a long time. And when it did, we printed up a lot of copies, partly because of the McCartney interview and the profile it had because of the record label. So there were a lot of people out there to read this. I think we printed at least 12,000 copies. That was a jump up from 4,000, maybe 3,000 to 4,000. They didn't all sell at the time, but it did sell very, very well. My friend Robin Richards, who's passed away subsequently, moved up from just designing the cover to designing whole chunks of the magazine, including the background of that statement. And so we had kind of the platform to have that kind of effect. And I don't want to. I really genuinely don't want to put too much on my own. Take too much credit for anything at all. What I do know is that my energy and enthusiasm got me a long way, and I think that comes across. And I am obviously really happy to know that it had that effect on Alan. I sort of did know and didn't know, and I'm happy to go into that now or later if you want. I sort of didn't know that Alan was affected by it.
And it seems like it was probably also a cool factor of that the magazine was established, but it was still very punk energy, whether that was what it was writing about or not. I mean, that gives you hope that you can retain that even. Because I think that's what a lot of people were let down about a lot of the synth pop is I think some people, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of that started as having a spirit of punk. It just sounded different and very quickly went big money and big label.
It's really, you're absolutely right. It's a very, very quick transition when you think about acts like OMD being on. I think they were on Factory to begin with.
At some point, they're on Factory.
And suddenly, 2-3 singles in, it's a pop duo. Soft Cell. I give Soft Cell a lot of credit, but man, they exploded quickly. And Depeche Mode, of course, on Mute Records, which Mute was this experimental, very, very experimental synth pop. Well, just synth electronic label that happened to discover the one band in the south of England that was out gigging and doing things oddly in a quite traditional way with untraditional instruments, and that took off. So you're completely right. Some of those bands came out of the spirit of punk, but they embraced the trappings and the trimmings of fortune and fame very, very quickly. All of these. It didn't take more than 2 or 3 singles to feel that OMD were over there, that Depeche Mode were over there, and I was not consciously anti-synths. I really don't think I was, not at all, actually. But I was always very much anti the trappings and trimmings of that fortune and fame. For me, it was always about the music and it was always about the spirit. And I agree with you. Yeah, I've got it right here, and I've been going through these back issues for the reason that I mentioned. And I like that issue of Jamming, it's partly fanzine, but it's also quite polished. It's printed on good paper. There's a really nice print to it. And Robin did some amazing designs, but all of it is typed. It was all done on a typewriter. There's no typesetting. There's still handwriting. Parts of it are still illegible, which was something that we carried on pretty much through to the end. There was always one page everywhere where we managed to screw things up and you couldn't read it or something went wrong. So it's definitely got the spirit. It's got the spirit of punk even. And right down to, I really liked it was Robin's choice to have a picture of the Beatles in Hamburg on the front cover, and actually a picture with Stu, not with Ringo. And I think that spoke to their rock and roll roots, as opposed to, look, we've got an interview with the guy who's just put out Ebony and Ivory. It wasn't that. It was like, we've got an interview with one of the original rockers.
And it just says that this is our vision and we're going to stick to it, and we don't have, there are rules, but they're not rules.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just struck that, so you're 18 when you wrote this, and you have this whole hypothesis about like the rock and roll cycle, or just like the quality of music cycle, kind of, and it's really fascinating. I'm just impressed that you came up with this at 18.
Yeah, I probably wrote it at 17 because that issue got delayed for a bunch of reasons, but it got delayed. There's a very good chance I wrote it at 17, but either way, yes, I can look back on it now. On one hand, I was a horribly precocious little kid, and to some degree, A, I must have been really annoying, and B, there were certain things I was carrying at school that I sort of don't wish on other people. I don't know what kind of gene I got, but in the early days at school, I seemed to be able to do it all. And there was a certain burden with that. I couldn't do the sports, so it wasn't everything, but there was a certain burden with that. And I think that's why I was already madly into music from day one, from like being born. But when punk happened, I really kind of switched over to that because I think it freed me up from these expectations people had on me. But the point maybe is I'd been studying music since I started listening to the radio at 7, started buying records at 8, went to my first concerts at the age of 11. But at the age of 12, I was going to shows on my own. At the age of 12, I went to see The Who at Charlton Athletic on my own, 80,000 people. I know what you're going to think about parenting, and you're kind of right.
I look back. I wish they were my parents.
Oh man, well, I've got this memoir, Boy About Town, in which my mother is absolutely the hero/heroine of the book. I mean, she's the coolest mum, but there is also this part of what the hell was she thinking? And so I had a lot of experience with this. And my mother was an English teacher and a chorister. My dad was a music professor, and I don't know if he'd written a book by then. He ended up writing a couple of books. I was disconnected from them musically, particularly my dad. And my parents were divorced, and I didn't get on with my dad. And there's a lot of connections. I realized pretty much everybody who ended up working at jamming had the same issue. I think that's not an uncommon thread. You don't have a dad around, and you're gravitating to father figures. You don't realize it at the time because you're young and you can't register that, but you realize down the line that a lot of this is you're out searching and seeking and trying to find a male voice that will speak to you because you don't have that male voice at home. But all of those things put together, I'd had a lot of practice, and so and I was totally cocky enough to come up with theories that would or would not stand some kind of secondary investigation, let alone the test of time.
I mean, I was certainly a music nerd at 17, but I was not coming up with my own musical theories about how rock and roll works. So that's just kind of amazing to me, just thinking about like, wow, like this guy really had it. This guy was really onto something.
Yeah, well, one thing to say to that is that we grew up quicker in Britain than in America. By several years. We were all leaving school at 16. Yes, maybe some people went on to college at 18. Even there, the college was 3 years. And everybody in my band left school at 16. I was at a grammar school, which is meant to be the better schools. They're not fee-paying schools. They're just this weird in-between school. My grammar school went state school in the middle of me being there, which is a whole other story. But what I'm trying to say is that I went to what was meant to be a reasonable school, and I think about 2/3 of us left school at 16 to go out and get jobs and go out into the world. So people were playing in bands from a very young age. People were engaged in music from a very, very young age. What I learned about coming to America, and then particularly falling in love with what we call the college rock scene, was that for Americans, this may still be true, people are at home until they're 18 and they finish high school. That's a given. You're a dropout if you leave earlier. And then you hope to go to college. When you get to college, that's where you find your real peer group. That's when you form a band. And possibly my favorite group in the world, REM, textbook story of that. That's how it happens. It means that you're in your 20s by the time you're putting out music. We grew in that punk generation. We were just in a hurry. Everybody seemed to be young, with the exception of Joe Strummer and the Stranglers, and everybody was rushing to put out music before they were 21 and old. And you looked at the idea of staying on at school till you're 18, or God forbid going off to college. It would be, I'm going to miss the best years of my life here. And I've sort of reflected on that a lot over the years, because part of me would like to have actually gone to college, but just not in those years. It wasn't right in 1982 for me to say, oh, and now I'm going to go off to college for 3 years and abandon my band, my record label, and my fanzine. It wasn't going to happen. But that's my theory on that. So as you can see, I developed other theories down the line. But that one I think actually does stand up to some scrutiny.
And you started the zine at 13, which is really impressive. And I'm curious, like, what was going on, and what was your inspiration at that time?
It's really straightforward. There was an article in Sounds. It was written by John Savage. It was about fanzines. It was the center pages. I think it was September 77. And his thing was very similar to what you're talking about with me, that I wrote sort of 5 years later. And it was there's a key quote in there that said, something is better than nothing. I think he listed these sort of 10 or 20 points about fanzines. And I probably didn't get any further than him writing something is better than nothing. And I looked at these collage of all these fanzines, these Xerox fanzines, and I just thought, that sounds like fun. I mean, it was as simple as that. And famously, I mean, to the extent that anybody cares about this story, but I've certainly said it enough. I mean, I was sitting in a math lesson at school doing the classic reading under the desk. I mean, bored of the maths already at just 13 and reading, whether it was my copy of Sounds or not, I don't know. But I was reading it under the desk, and I came out of that lesson and asked my friend John Matthews, who's still my friend to this day, do you want to do a fanzine with me? And I think he's still wondering why he said no, because he would have been perfect, because he has actually still to this day got the hippest music taste of anybody my age I know. He's ridiculously well connected and hip. But he said no, why don't you ask Lawrence? And Lawrence was into hard rock. His dad actually ran or was head of the big security company in London, so he got to go to lots of shows. So we started out actually doing more of a hard rock fanzine than a punk fanzine, which is why I say it took a year. It took a year to get going properly.
And that interview with Mark Perry, which you posted on your site, is amazing, and it's really you really have some guts. Like, you're asking some kind of challenging questions for a 14-year-old kid.
I think you don't know better when you're that age. That's the great thing about youth. You're too dumb to know that you need to be polite and respectful. You just kind of come out and I do look back on some of that. And these days I do interviews with people and I work up towards the difficult questions. I mean, you can almost feel the interview ramp up. In those days when you're young, you just don't know better. I doubt if Mark Perry cared. I mean, some other people might have been thrown out a little bit or thrown off a little bit, but Mark Perry obviously...
He almost invites it.
Yeah, I mean, he came from that school. He's the one who did the... obviously encouraged a lot of people to start fanzines, but that would... And funny enough, I mean, he's South London, not far from me, but that hadn't reached me. What reached me was the Weekly Music Press doing this story on fanzines right at the point that I started buying the weekly music papers. And I may have borrowed that copy. I don't know. I could have borrowed it off John Matthews for all I know, because he seemed to somehow have the pocket money to buy more than one music paper a week. But I only found out about Sniffing Glue really through reading that piece in Sounds. And I find it kind of interesting. It was John Savage that wrote that, because he turned into an amazing journalist. But I never really think of him as being this sort of spiky, punky, fanzine kind of person. And it was a shock when I was able to go back and see that it was John Savage who wrote that, because equally that piece had the influence on me. And so I guess, generationally, a few years later down the line, I'm doing my own little thing. It has an effect on somebody else like Alan.
Yeah, I mean, I just love that you're actually kind of pushing him on a couple of things, like, why did you kick this guy out of the band, or why did this happen? And where those are the kinds of questions that I would want to ask someone that I'd probably be terrified to do, but you're just out there doing it.
Yeah, well, the other thing is also when you're kids, you can also get away with that. So not only do you not know any better, but you can get away with it because...
Yeah, I mean, he probably thought it was cool you were 14 too, in a way.
He would have thought that. And what's somebody going to do to a 14-year-old? I mean, the worst they're going to say is... I think a year or so later, I was doing a second interview with The Jam, and we got very comfortable with The Jam, and a couple of my friends were there. And it's a pretty funny interview because... I'm challenging them on some things, and they end up saying, Paul says, it is kind of easy for you kids just to be here and, call us on this, but you're not in our shoes. And there's truth to that. So there's a point at which somebody will catch you on it. And I think Paul was able to do that because he knew me better at that point. But when you're 14, especially if your voice hasn't even broken, nobody's going to give you too hard a time for asking a tough question.
Yeah.
I remember being, 20 or 21 and interviewing bands that I was, pretty excited about. But I'm curious, when you were 13, that must have been kind of mind blowing for some bands. What were the bands where you were just, shaking in your shoes?
The obvious ones would have been the first two big interviews that I did, which, I mean, it's amazing that the first interview I did with any musician was the person that the person I most looked up to out of the whole punk new wave thing, which was Paul Weller. And it's only about 3 interviews later that I interviewed my all-time idol, Pete Townsend. And I doubt if it would have gotten more scary than that. Interviewing McCartney was obviously a really big deal, and an incredibly big deal because he hadn't been doing interviews. So he hadn't been doing interviews since Lennon had been sadly killed. He was just starting them up, but that wasn't even why he was doing this particular one. Mccartney did an amazing job of putting me at ease, and I think I was probably intensely nervous about going up to the studio to meet the Jam, or to meet Weller. He was the only one in the studio that day. And I think everybody did their best to put me at ease. When we did Townsend, 4 of us got together to go across South London, and we could never, I mean, the buses were terrible, the tubes were terrible. You'd have to leave like 2 hours early, and that's also not part of being a school kid. So we showed up an hour late with a posse. I remember Pete saying, I didn't realize you were going to bring a posse. and we got there, and his assistant, who is still his assistant, actually, wow. Nicola, saying, you guys are an hour late. He's doing something else. But there's 4 of us. We said, well, I had to wait for my mate, and then then we had to wait for somebody else, and then we had to wait, and then we had to wait for the bus, and then we had to wait for the tube. Yeah. And somehow Pete found time for us and gave us an hour and a half. So people were very, very, very good to me, to us, and I think most of them remember what it was like. McCartney said this to me. And at this point, I was 17, so I was considerably, a little bit older. But he said, I remember what this was like. I remember waiting outside the Liverpool, whatever, the ABC, to meet the crew cuts. He specifically cited the crew cuts. So I waited outside the backstage door, and when they came out, I got chatting with them, and they let me walk with them back to the hotel. It meant the world to me that a band would speak to me. So he's like, hey, here I am, fire away. Ask me questions.
That's so great.
Going back for a moment to the statement, you have this theory, which we talked about before, about these like 4 8-year cycles, and this was written in 82. Did it play out? Did it get better in 84? Did things come around again?
No. Yes and no. What was really interesting is that one thing that was really interesting. I mean, at the end of 82, the Jam broke up, and the Jam was so big in Britain, it's hard to explain or get somebody to understand how big they were. They were enormously successful, popular. Their breaking up was like the Beatles breaking up after 3-4 albums. Like, guys, you got more in you. And they did have more in them. But anyway, they broke up. And everybody was sort of trying to particularly in the music business, was trying to place bets on who would be succeeding the Jam. And pretty much everybody got it wrong. It was the Smiths. And the Smiths were on rough trade. And I think that is not a small deal by any way, shape or form. That this label, this scrappy label that was run out of a record shop that sold fanzines. I would spend a lot of time in the back rooms and upstairs of that place, and it was chaos. It was always chaos, and that label, record shop distributor got to build and have the band that then became the biggest band, the most important band in Britain of the 80s. So that was not a small deal. Obviously, it took Creation a lot longer to come up with Oasis, but Creation were having hits with Jesus and Mary Chain in the 80s. Go Discs was independent with Billy Bragg and the House Martins. And, it's an odd one. I think most people I know always did have enormous respect for Daniel Miller and Mute Records. Like, even if they didn't love Depeche Mode or thought Erasure were very, very commercial, they had utmost respect for the fact that he was selling enormous amounts of records as an entirely independent label. Factory had the success with New Order, and New Order charted, and then they had the biggest 12-inch selling 12-inch single in the world. Factory was an independent out of that era. So a lot of that actually did come to fruition. I don't think this is remotely comparable, but Jamming went ahead and became a mainstream magazine, became a monthly after a period. So a lot of that kind of did hold up. I tend to look on the mid-80s as a dark period because of Thatcherism. And the artists that I really loved, most of them were reflecting those hard times. The Smiths were this wonderful exception because Morrissey was reflecting those hard times, and yet the music was really joyous. And everybody who thought the Smiths were not joyous they were the depressed ones, because the fans thought the music was joyous.
Sure, yeah. It definitely was.
Yeah, so it was a misunderstanding on the part of the people who weren't part of the Smiths audience to begin with. But they were an exception. And when you listen to, actually the House Martins made very cheerful music, but there's a lot that of the mid-'80s that to me becomes darker because of the period we were going through. The miners' strike in Britain was a big, heavy deal. It was a low-grade civil war that went on for a year. And interestingly, when she was elected the third time, I was kind of done and trying to find my way to America and succeeded. But right around that time, Acid House happened. Well, House happened in America, then in Chicago, then Acid House happened in the UK, then the whole rave scene took off. And so to the extent that I actually got that wrong, the 10 years later was actually Acid House. And I think if you do go to the UK and you try and draw a line in the UK, I think you'll find it's more like every 10 years. And you do see this line. So people sometimes say to me, because I've written books subsequently, when I did the book on Wilson Pickett, I got a lot of questions about, well, what's a white Brit doing writing about Wilson Pickett? And I'm like, because that's part of the British lineage. That there are people who are my friends who will go sort of rock and roll, 60s music, which includes all the soul and the British bands, punk, rave. And so a lot of the figures, the key figures in the rave scene were ex-punks. And that's a very, very, very clear line to me. So I actually believe that the next real generation that came through was about 10 years later, and it was Acid House, the rave scene. And that was the next time that I saw Britain excited. In fact, I've never actually ever seen the country so excited. I was coming back from the States, and punk was an outlier. Punk was really quite marginal, and punks were getting attacked by other people on the streets. Johnny Rotten famously got slashed, and there was a lot of antagonism. You had to be brave to be a punk. You didn't have to be brave to be a raver. The whole country went rave. It was amazing. The whole country went Acid House, Smiley culture for a year or two. I mean, it was really, really bizarre. And to me, that's the last really big scene that I've been aware of, if you don't count the sort of subcultures that come out of all these major moments. And I would love, to me, there's a conversation I've never really gotten to the bottom of why don't we have more things like that? That's an ongoing conversation, I think.
Yeah, it is strange. I agree.
Yeah. I mean, there was grunge, but grunge wasn't British. Grunge was American. Right. And there was Britpop, but Britpop was sort of very, it happened, but I don't know that was necessarily a nationwide movement. I think it was more like a nationwide craze for a little period. Right.
And there's a bit of gazing back. And I mean, it's based on something that already happened in a sense, I guess you could say. So it seems like from the statement that sort of the thing that was the most clear point that happened is that the independent labels were more set up to compete with the majors than they were when punk happened. Like, just by saying the Mute and Rough Trade were better positioned to deal with a bigger band. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, they were able to. Well, I think a lot of the bands that came through wanted to have that personal relationship and keep it. So people like Depeche Mode, Erasure continued to trust Daniel Miller. New Order continued to trust Tony Wilson, and the Smiths trusted, Johnny Marr trusted Jeff Travis all the way down the line at Rough Trade. And if you've ever had any dealings with the majors, I mean, they can't change their ways. It's all market driven, it's all money driven, it's all research driven. And the moment you sign with them, the exceptions, the artists who've been able to do what they want on major labels are so few and far between that people sometimes think, oh, that's how it is. No, they're the exceptions that prove the rule that majors typically don't know their ass from their elbow, and they will destroy more bands than they will ever break. And so I've always given credit to those groups that have stuck with independence and stuck with the people who got them where they were in the first place. And a lot of the time when you speak to those people, if you speak to them, they seem pretty comfortable with having done that. I understand everybody who's sort of chased the money, but I think when we look back, we're more likely to talk about our New Orders and our Depeche Modes than we are about a lot of other groups that came through a sort of synth pop 80s.
That's a good point. People can still sense the sort of independent spirit of those bands, or the inspiring spirit.
Yeah, and when I was doing my book on the Smiths, Johnny Marr was making his point very, very vehemently that he was saying if you pick up a Smith single cover from that era, you know it's not on a major label. He said before you look at the back and see Rough Trade. We were having a good discussion about this. He said, major label, they just wouldn't have. It just looked indie.
Same indie. Graphic would not look the same.
It would not. It would have been tidied up just enough.
Yeah. So cool. I mean, there was so much to talk about. We didn't even have time to talk about how our guest has climbed Mount Kilimanjaro.
Another time.
I know.
You can come with me next time.
I'm gonna have to. I'm gonna have to run a little bit more. But we really appreciate your time, Tony. It's been super fun, and we may have to ask you to come back again.
All right. Well, I love doing it. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Good luck with the whole thing. Cheers, guys. You can hear the unedited interview with myself on the debut 50 Years of Fun podcast. There will be links in the show notes, which you can find on your phone. Just look at your phone, look at the app, or look at the webpage you're listening on. There should be a link somewhere to something. And my thanks, of course, to Matt and Scott again for doing such a thorough job with the interview and also for taking on this marathon task of documenting the first 50 releases on Creation. Basic math says 1 episode a month. It's a 4 to 5 year venture. Apparently Alan McGee says he'll get on when they're finished. So let's hope that in 2025, 2026 we're all still alive and kicking. Just a couple of rearguard observations. Alan McGee kind of implied my old band was called Zeitgeist. There was a band on the Jamming Records label called Zeitgeist, and they played his Communication Club the same night as my band Apocalypse played Communication Club, Alan's old club in London, so easy mistake to make. But on that note, there's going to be a future podcast in which I talk to Jaffo, the singer from Zeitgeist, who are from Cornwall, and I also talked to Brian Young, who was, for my money, the frontman of Rudy, who were not only the first band on the Jamming Records label, but the first band on the Good Vibrations label out of Belfast, Northern Ireland. Another great movie, by the way, about a record label entrepreneur. Good Vibrations. You should watch it if you haven't already. So that episode will be coming down the line. It's an opportunity to talk about some independent record scene stuff and also about regional music scenes. There's also another episode coming in which I talk with 4 more former contributors to Jamming, and one of them, Bruce Dessau, wrote a lot about Creation, and he even went on tour on assignment for Jamming, ended up in Germany standing in for one of the Jesus and Mary chain because back then things got blurry. As far as the next episode goes, well, it's going to drop on the same day as the Rest of the World publication of this book. And so I thought it would be a good time to release the episode in which I sat down in person and had a conversation with the photographer Russell Young and the writer Chris Heath. Both of them have gone on to considerable acclaim. I think it's fair to say they both got their start in music journalism photography with Jamming. Yeah, I know. And all 3 of us found ourselves in New York City at the same time at the end of September. It was a wonderful opportunity for a reunion. Both Russell and Chris, like myself, have ended up in the States, but we've never been together since back in the Jamming days. And I have to say, in terms of circling round and revisiting past periods of your life and doing this podcast and this book, it's not about republishing a fanzine, got no great calling for that. It's really a wonderful excuse to reunite with people that otherwise I may not have re-established that contact with. And one other thing, you heard me talking about my old school friend, John Matthews. He was on the first episode of this podcast, From Classroom to the Clubs, or From Classroom to Clubs, as was Richard Hurd, whose Cockney voice you hear up front on the introduction, and Jenny DeHart, who will be the last voice that you will hear on this podcast because she is doing the credits. Take care out there. Bye-bye.
This episode of the Jamming Fanzine podcast was produced by Tony Fletcher. Greg Morton provided editing assistance and designed the logo. The Jamming Fanzine podcast theme was written, recorded and produced by Noel Fletcher. The book The Best of Jamming, Selections and Stories from the Fanzine That Grew Up, 1977 to 86, is published by Omnibus Press and is available right now across Europe, and then in the rest of the world from the 2nd of December 2021. For more information, please visit tonyfletcher.net or omnibuspress.com. Check the show notes for more details, and if you like what you hear, please hit subscribe, leave a review, a rating, or share. We'll be back on the podcast